The throne room had never felt so small, so suffocating, so violently exposed. Smoke still curled from shattered torches, drifting like ghostly fingers across the broken floor where soldiers had fallen only minutes earlier. Light bled through cracks in the ceiling. It made the dust sparkle in the air like the remnants of something sacred that had been crushed. King Oba Adekunle stood trapped against what remained of his throne, his back pressed to the splintered gold frame as though he hoped it would swallow him. His crown, once a symbol of invincible power, hung crooked on his head, cracked open down the center, like a symbol of his unraveling mind. His eyes were wide and wild, darting from the snarling lions a crowd of servants and villagers gathering at the edges of the wreckage. Sweat soaked through his royal robes. Fear clung to him the way arrogance once had. The night had stripped him bare. The people who had once bowed before him now watched him with something he had never seen on their faces: judgment, anger, and a slowly growing courage. Amara stepped forward to the wrecked hall, her heartbeat echoing in her throat, but her face steady. She no longer looked like the small maid who swept the palace floors or carried buckets of water through the servants' corridor. The chaos had carved something new into her. Her posture carried a quiet strength, and her steps, though slow, did not tremble. Kimo walked beside her, wounded but towering, his golden mane streaked with dust and blood from the battle. 2 other lions followed, circling protectively as though they recognized her as something sacred. Every pair of eyes turned to her, not because she demanded attention, but because she carried a calm that everyone else had lost. The echoes of last night rang through the hall. The screams, the arrows, the king's enraged orders, the thunder of claws against armor. But now, surrounded by broken stone and broken power, Amara felt strangely still, like a storm had passed and left her standing in the eye of something bigger. She kept her gaze locked on the king, watching how he recoiled with each step she took, as though the simple sight of her stripped away the last of his delusions. Outside the palace walls, the roar of the villagers grew louder. By morning, the kingdom had woken to the truth. Their ruler had turned his guards against his own people, fired arrows into a crowd, ordered the slaughter of unarmed servants, and tried to kill a girl whose only crime was compassion. The chaos of the previous night had spilled into the entire city. Markets shut down, mothers pulled children indoors, and men gathered in clusters whispering about rebellion. Word spread like wildfire. The lions protected her. The gods have left the king. Now those same villagers, faced with the shattered gates and a trail of bodies that stretched inside, pushed through the palace entrance in frenzied waves. They flooded the throne room, forming a semicircle around the king, but no one moved forward to touch him. They had no need to. The entire kingdom had already seen him stripped of power. His advisors stood apart from him, trembling, refusing to meet his eyes. Even they knew this man was no longer their shield. Amid the shouts and footsteps, one thing became unmistakably clear. The king wasn't cornered by lions. He was cornered by the consequences of every cruelty he had ignored for years. Oba's voice cracked when he finally spoke. You dare stand against your king?" he rasped, but the words carried no weight. They sounded like a plea more than a threat. His hands shook as he tried to straighten his broken crown, but it fell sideways again, mocking him. He lifted a trembling arm and pointed at Amara, but even he seemed unsure what accusation he wanted to make. You are nothing. A servant. A weak, stupid. His sentence dissolved into a choke as Kimo growled, a sound so deep and resonant it felt like the ground vibrated with it. The king stumbled sideways, gripping the throne for balance. Gone was the man who once commanded armies. In his place stood someone stripped of every illusion, just an aging tyrant, overwhelmed by the ghost of his own sins. Amara didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She simply stood there, her breath steady, her eyes steady, her presence stronger than any sword. For the first time in his reign, Oba Adekunle faced someone he could not intimidate, and the kingdom watched breath held, as the final pieces of his power slid away like sand through desperate fingers. Amara didn't move at first. She stood there in the quiet, half-collapsed throne hall, her fingers still trembling from the weight of everything she'd just survived. Kimo pressed against her leg, his breath hot and uneven, his mane drenched with sweat and streaked with dry blood. The villagers waited behind her, uncertain, almost afraid to break the silence. For years, The king's voice had dominated these halls, shouting orders, delivering punishments, twisting every whisper into fear. Now that he was gone, the air itself felt strange, as if the palace couldn't decide whether to breathe or collapse. Amara took one step forward, her heel crunching softly over broken marble, and lowered herself beside Chemo. She placed a hand against the lion's face, not to command him, not to calm him, but simply to let him know she understood the price he had paid. The villagers watched her with a mixture of awe and disbelief. This girl who once scrubbed floors until her hands bled was now the only steady voice left in a kingdom trembling on the edge of rebirth. Outside the ruined hall, the sound of scattered footsteps and muffled sobs drifted through the corridors. More villagers were entering, cautiously at first, peering through shattered arches and broken doors, as if expecting the king to rise again from the shadows. Mothers clutched their children, old men leaned on sticks, and groups of servants, still bruised and shaken from years of cruelty, stood huddled together, silently waiting for someone to tell them what to do next. But Amara didn't speak yet. She couldn't. Her chest rose and fell as she forced herself to look around the enormous hall, taking in the fallen banners, the burned curtains, the overturned braziers spilling ash across the floor. This was the place where she had once scrubbed blood from the tiles, while guards laughed. This was where she learned how deeply fear could settle into someone's bones. Yet now, for the first time, she didn't feel fear pressing down on her ribs. She felt responsibility. Heavy, slow, and real. She knew that whatever happened next, whoever led these people, would determine whether the kingdom healed or simply replace one tyrant with another. And she refused to let everything Chemo, the lions, and the people sacrificed end with another ruler repeating the same cycle. A soft shuffle near the edge of the hall caught her attention. She turned to find Mara, the oldest remaining advisor, limping cautiously toward her. The man's robe was torn, his face streaked with soot, and his eyes carried years of guilt. "Amara," he said, his voice cracking. "The people, they need direction. They need someone to tell them they're safe now." His words should have sounded simple, but something in the way he said them made her tighten her jaw. Safe. What a fragile word. This kingdom had lived generations without knowing what safety felt like. What did it even mean to tell people they were safe when the walls around them still smelled of smoke and death? Amara rose slowly, steadying herself as Chemo shifted his weight beside her. She didn't speak to the advisor. Instead, she walked past him, the lion following with a faint limp, and approached the grand entrance of the throne hall. The massive double doors had been blasted open earlier by the villagers, their iron hinges bent like melted wax. Sunlight poured through the gap, painting long stripes across the floor, and when Amara stepped into it, she felt its warmth hit her skin like a promise she wasn't ready to name. Outside, the scene was overwhelming. Hundreds of villagers filled the courtyard, men and women who had marched in fury, expecting to die if that's what it took to end the king's rule. Now they stood scattered in groups, uncertain, exhausted, clinging to each other, their expressions shifting between relief and shock. As Amara stepped out, a hush spread through the crowd. She didn't climb the steps. She didn't raise her hands like a ruler. She simply stood there, her clothes torn, her hair tangled, her face marked by smoke and fear, and that honesty was enough to quiet even the farthest voices. Chemo stood at her side, his presence commanding without being threatening, the kind of guardian who didn't need to be told to protect what mattered. Amara took a breath and finally spoke, her voice almost too soft to carry, but somehow heard anyway. "It's over. You're free." The words left her lips like something she'd been holding back for years, something she hadn't entirely believed yet, but desperately wanted to. A ripple moved through the crowd. Some people gasped, others cried, others simply closed their eyes as if hearing the sentence they prayed for every night. For a moment, the entire courtyard seemed to breathe together. But freedom alone wasn't enough. Not when people had no homes left, no food, no sense of structure, no idea who should guide them to the broken days ahead. Amara knew that. She felt the weight of it pressing against her chest. A different kind of fear. One that didn't come from violence, but from responsibility bigger than she had ever imagined carrying. The villagers slowly approached her, not pushing, not shouting, just stepping closer, drawn by something they didn't yet have words for. A woman stepped forward first, holding a child whose face was streaked with tears and dirt. "What happens now?" the woman asked gently. Amara didn't have a perfect answer, but she had the truth, and she knew that if this kingdom was ever going to stand again, the truth had to be the foundation. She looked at the child, then at the people behind them, faces full of uncertainty, hope, fear, exhaustion, and said, "We rebuild together. No one stands above anyone else. Not anymore." Her voice wavered, but the conviction behind it was steady, real, and unmistakably human. The courtyard stirred with murmurs, not opposition, but relief mixed with disbelief. The idea of equality wasn't something this kingdom had ever been taught. People had lived so long under the king's rule that they had forgotten what it felt like to choose anything for themselves. Amara understood that too. Change couldn't be forced. It had to be carried slowly, carefully, by people who believed in it. She stepped down from the cracked stone platform and moved among the villagers, placing a hand on his shoulder here, a reassuring touch there. Chemo followed closely, occasionally nuzzling those who reached out to him. This wasn't a coronation. This wasn't the rise of a new ruler. This was the beginning of healing, messy, uncertain, imperfect healing. And as Amara walked through those people, listening to their fears, answering what she could, offering comfort where she had none to spare, she realized something quietly, almost painfully. She wasn't leading because she wanted power. She was leading because no one else knew how to carry a kingdom that had been broken for so long, and she refused to let it crumble again. Amara kept moving through the courtyard long after the initial shock faded, listening to each frightened voice, each whispered fear, each trembling confession of people who suddenly didn't know what their lives meant anymore. They clung to her not because she wore a crown or carried authority, but because she was the only person who had stood against the king without seeking anything for herself. That alone gave them something to hold on to, something like trust, though none of them dared call it that yet. As she walked, she felt Chemo's steady warmth behind her, the lion acting as both shield and reassurance. Every few steps, someone reached out to lightly touch his mane, as if seeking courage from the very creature who had helped end their suffering. For the first time in his life, Chemo didn't pull away. He accepted their trembling hands with a quiet grace that surprised even Amara. But beneath that grace, she felt his exhaustion. His breaths were shallow, his steps slower than before, his muscles trembling from strain and injury. She glanced at him, worry tightening her stomach. The kingdom might have survived this day, but she wasn't sure Chemo would unless she found help soon. By late afternoon, the courtyard had become a restless sea of movement. People were bringing out blankets, carrying the wounded, searching for lost family members, sharing whatever food they had left. A few former guards sat apart from everyone else, visibly ashamed, their armor discarded, their expressions hollow. Amara approached them quietly while the others maintained their distance. Fear and anger still lingered in the air around anyone associated with the old regime. One of the guards, a man who looked no older than 20, kept his head down, tears dripping onto his hands. "We didn't want any of it," he whispered as she neared. "We were born into his rule. We didn't know what else to be." Amara crouched in front of him, her voice soft but firm. "You know now." The young man lifted his eyes, and for the first time she saw something vulnerable beneath the armor he'd once worn so proudly. She didn't absolve him, didn't condemn him either. She simply stood, helped him rise to his feet, and told him quietly, "If you want to make amends, start by helping those who fear you." He nodded with trembling sincerity that felt real, not rehearsed. In that moment, Amara understood the truth. Rebuilding the kingdom wasn't just about lifting the oppressed. It was about teaching the lost how to be something other than tools of cruelty. As the sun dipped behind the distant hills, bathing the ruins of the palace in deep amber, Amara knew she needed to gather everyone, villagers, servants, surviving advisors, even former guards, and speak to them before night fell. The kingdom was fragile, held together by nothing but shared grief and her voice. If she didn't give that grief direction, fear would fill the cracks. People would argue, blame, divide, and the kingdom would break again, maybe worse than before. She climbed the widest staircase leading toward the outer terrace, a place once reserved for royal announcements. Now its marble railing hung shattered, vines had grown through its cracks, and the once-polished floor bore scorch marks from the clashes earlier that day. It wasn't grand anymore, but maybe that was what made it perfect. She stood before the crowd gathering below, thousands now filling every corner of the courtyard and surrounding pathways. The murmurs died slowly as more people realized she was preparing to speak. Chemo collapsed beside her, not in defeat, but in relief, his body finally giving in to exhaustion now that he sensed the danger had passed. She rested her hand on his mane, drawing strength from the faint rise and fall of his breath. Amara spoke with a voice that wasn't loud, yet carried effortlessly through the crowd. "If you're here tonight," she began, "it means you survived him. That alone is something to honor." Faces lifted. Some stood straighter. Others wept silently. She continued, each word shaped by the reality of what she had witnessed, what they had all endured. "We don't have a king anymore, and I won't replace him. No one will. This kingdom doesn't need another throne to fear." A wave of surprise moved through the crowd. The advisors exchanged uneasy glances. They had expected her to accept the role. But Amara pressed on. "What we need now is something we've never truly had, a voice that belongs to all of us. Decisions made together. Justice carried by the hands of many, not crushed by the will of one." She paused, letting the message settle. A few villagers started nodding. Others looked uncertain, but not resistant. She didn't promise miracles. She didn't offer grand speeches. She told them the truth they needed most. "We are broken, but we are still here, and we will rise, slowly, painfully, but honestly." Her voice cracked then, not out of weakness, but humanity. The people felt it, and for the first time, they believed her. When she finished speaking, the crowd didn't erupt into cheers. They didn't chant her name. Instead, something far more powerful happened. The entire courtyard bowed their heads, not as a sign of submission, but of shared grief and respect. The quiet was profound, almost sacred. Amara felt tears gather in her eyes, though she blinked them away quickly. She wasn't ready to cry in front of thousands. Not yet. She stepped off the terrace and made her way back into the palace with Chemo limping beside her. Night was settling in, wrapping the ruins in deep shadows. Torches flickered along the hallways as villagers moved through them, trying to create small pockets of rest and warmth. Amara walked toward the lower chamber where the healers were gathering, hoping they could help Chemo before his condition worsened. She knelt beside him as they examined his injuries. "Stay with me," she whispered, her fingers pressing gently into his mane. "We're not done." Chemo lifted his head weakly and nudged her hand, a gesture so soft and trusting it nearly broke her. She leaned forward, resting her forehead against his, letting the moment settle into her heart like a vow. No matter how heavy the days ahead became, she wouldn't face them alone. Amara stayed there with her forehead against Chemo's, letting her breath fall in rhythm with his shallow, trembling exhales. Around her, the healers moved quietly, their hands steady, their murmured instructions soft but urgent. The room had once been a storage chamber for the king's treasures, golden shields, jeweled daggers, silk tapestries that no servant dared disturb. Now those symbols of vanity lay scattered on the floor, pushed aside to make space for the wounded. Oil lamps burned along the walls, casting a warm gold over every face in the room, illuminating exhaustion and hope in equal measure. Amara lifted her head slowly, just enough to watch the healers press poultices against Chemo's wounds, each touch careful, reverent. A young healer, not more than 16, looked up at her with eyes shining from unshed tears. "He fought for you," she whispered. "No beast has ever done that." Amara swallowed hard. "He didn't fight for me," she replied quietly, brushing her fingers over Chemo's ear. "He fought for all of us." The healer nodded, as if trying to understand a truth larger than her years. Outside the chamber, the sounds of the reorganizing kingdom drifted in. Footsteps, hushed conversations, attempt to rebuild order where none had existed for years. But beneath those sounds was an undertone Amara hadn't heard before: relief. Fragile, tentative, but real. She could feel it pressing toward her like a soft breeze. Yet she knew relief alone wasn't enough. A kingdom could not survive on relief. It needed direction, structure, a foundation that cruelty had long erased. And despite everything she had done today, despite every risk, every wound, every choice. She was terrified she wasn't enough to give him that. When Chemo finally drifted into a steadier sleep, Amara rose to her feet, feeling the heaviness in her knees. The healers urged her to rest, but she shook her head. The night was too young, and the responsibilities too large. She stepped into the corridor, where guards, now stripped of ranking marks and royal insignias, stood quietly, not as enforcers of tyranny, but as volunteers trying to offer some sense of safety. One of them approached her hesitantly, removing his helmet with both hands. "Mistress Amara," he began, stumbling over the title like it tasted unfamiliar. "The elders and village leaders have gathered in the council hall. They're waiting for you." His voice cracked at the end, not from fear, but from a strange mixture of guilt and hope, two emotions the kingdom had spent years suppressing. Amara nodded gently and followed him through the long hallway. The once polished floors were scratched and muddy, bearing the marks of chaos and survival. Tapestries lay ripped along the walls, hanging like defeated flags. But the torches that lined the corridor burned bright, their flame steady, refusing to waver. Something about that steadiness gave her strength. As she approached the council hall, she heard the murmur of many voices, low, uncertain, scattered. The doors were open, and as she stepped inside, the entire room fell silent as if a gust of wind had extinguished every sound. More than 100 people filled the hall, village elders, merchants, blacksmiths, farmer representatives, midwives, healers, and refugees from nearby settlements. No royal official presided over them now. The old order had collapsed, leaving a vacuum filled only by anxious hearts searching for leadership. Amara stood at the threshold, suddenly feeling the weight of each gaze. She wasn't wearing royal fabrics. Her hands were still stained from Chemo's blood. Her braids were loose, her clothes torn at the sleeves. But none of that mattered, because when the people looked at her, they didn't see perfection. They saw someone who had bled with them, someone who refused to bow even when the world expected her to break. An elder woman with silver-threaded braids stepped forward, leaning heavily on a carved walking stick. "Child," she said softly, "you ended the king's reign, but what comes next must be chosen by all of us. Sit with us. Speak with us. Help us shape what this kingdom will become." Amara lowered her head in gratitude and moved to join them, though her heart thudded with uncertainty. The discussion that followed stretched into the deep hours of night, weaving through every fear, every wound, every dream the people had buried for years. Some elders argued for a council-based rule. Others feared chaos without a single leader to anchor decisions. A merchant suggested rebuilding the throne room, to use it, not as a symbol of power, but as a chamber of justice where leaders could be questioned openly. A healer recommended establishing a place where lions could be protected instead of hunted, honoring their role in ending the tyranny. An idea that startled many but resonated more than Amara expected. Every voice carried a piece of truth, and Amara listened to each one with patience, even when their words clashed. She didn't speak often, but when she did, the hall quieted because they recognized her honesty, her lack of personal ambition. She wasn't trying to build a new crown for herself. She was trying to build a foundation for everyone. Near midnight, the room shifted, subtly but unmistakably. The arguing softened. The tension eased. People began speaking not from fear, but from possibility. The kingdom, broken as it was, had taken its first breath of self-governance. When the final consensus formed, it was simple yet profound. A temporary council of 12 would lead until a permanent structure could be created, and Amara would serve as the council's guiding voice, not its ruler, but its anchor of compassion. The decision wasn't made out of expectation or pressure. It came from trust, deep, earned trust. When the meeting finally ended, the leaders rose to leave, each touching Amara's shoulder as they passed, a sign of gratitude and unity. She walked out the hall with her heart full and trembling at once. The kingdom had begun to heal, but dawn would come with new challenges, new fears, new responsibilities she couldn't yet name. As she stepped back into the quiet corridor, she glanced toward the chamber where Chemo rested. His silhouette lay still behind the flickering lamplight. Amara closed her eyes briefly and whispered into the silence, "We're not done yet, but we're on our way." And for the first time since the throne shattered, she allowed herself a breath that didn't feel borrowed from courage. It felt like her own. Amara lingered in the hallway for a moment longer, letting the quiet settle around her like a soft cloak. The torches as faintly as their flames reached upward, casting long shadows across the cracked stone walls. The palace felt different now, still wounded, still trembling from the violence it had endured. But beneath that pain, something new pulsed. A heartbeat, a beginning. When Amara finally turned toward Chemo's chamber, her steps were slow, almost reverent. She pushed open the door gently and found the great lion sleeping in the circle of lamplight, his chest rising in deep, steady breaths. The healers had left fresh water beside him and covered his injuries with clean linen scented faintly of herbs. A few servants dozed against the far wall, unwilling to leave his side even for a moment. Amara sank to her knees beside Chemo and rested her hand on his mane. The world outside felt impossibly large, full of responsibilities she barely understood. But here, beside the friend who would save her life again and again, she allowed herself a moment of quiet. "You're part of this, too," she whispered, brushing her fingers through his fur. "Whatever future we build, you helped make it possible." Chemo's ear twitched, and though he remained asleep, something in his breathing softened, as if he could sense the peace settling over the room. Amara leaned her head back and looked around at the people who had gathered here without being asked. Guards who had laid down their blades, servants who had learned courage in the darkest hours, and healers who treated lion and human alike with equal devotion. These were the threads from which the kingdom's future would be woven, and she felt a fierce determination grow in her chest. They deserved a life where fear didn't live in every shadow. They deserved mornings not stained with blood. They deserved to breathe freely again. And for the first time, she truly believed they could. The next morning arrived quietly, as though the sun itself was unsure how to touch a palace that had witnessed so much suffering. Its early rays filtered through broken windows, spilling across the floors in warm bands of gold that made the ruins look almost sacred. Amara woke stiff and sore, her hand still resting on Chemo's paw. She stretched slowly, careful not to disturb him, and stepped into the corridor where the air carried the faint smell of smoke, dust, and something unfamiliar: hope. Dozens of people were already awake. Guards repaired the shattered gates. Servants swept away debris. Elders organized supplies for the families who had taken refuge inside the palace during the chaos. No one barked orders. No one struck another out of frustration or fear. They simply worked, shoulder to shoulder, like pieces of a kingdom remembering how to fit together again. As Amara walked through the courtyard, people stopped what they were doing and turned to watch her, not with the frightened obedience they had once shown the king, but with gratitude, raw, quiet, powerful. A young girl ran toward her with a basket of fruit balanced in her arms. "Mama says this is for you," she said breathlessly, "because you helped the lions and you helped us." Amara knelt, touched by the offering. "Thank you," she whispered, taking one of the oranges and placing it gently back in the girl's hands. "Share it with your mother. She needs strength too." The child nodded and scampered away. As Amara stood again, several guards approached her, men who once followed the king blindly, their loyalty chained by fear. Today, their faces carried a different expression: sincerity. One of them, a tall man with a jagged scar across his cheek, bowed his head. "We want to protect the palace under the council's rule," he said, "not as soldiers of fear, but as guardians of peace. If you will have us." Amara studied them for a moment, seeing the truth in their eyes. These were not the same men who had chased servants through hallways, who had carried out orders without question. Something had shifted inside them, broken open by the chaos of the night before. "Serve the people," she said softly. "Not a throne, not a crown. If you can promise that, then yes, we need you." Each guard placed a hand over his heart in silent oath, and for a fleeting moment, Amara felt the weight on her shoulders lighten. The kingdom wasn't waiting for her alone to save it. It was standing up alongside her. Later that afternoon, the temporary council assembled again, this time in the courtyard where the first rebellion had erupted. The cracked tiles still bore the marks of lions' claws and soldiers' boots, but the space felt transformed by sunlight and the presence of hundreds of people who gathered to witness what came next. Amara stood at the center with the 12 council members behind her. They had spent the morning finalizing decisions: how food would be distributed, how the wounded would be cared for, how mourners would be given space to bury their dead with dignity. Now, the kingdom waited for their first official message. Amara stepped forward, feeling every pair of eyes settle on her. She inhaled deeply, steadying her voice. "This palace was once a place of fear," she began. "A place where the cries of the innocent went unheard, where the weight of one man's cruelty crushed the lives of many. Yesterday, that era ended, not because of magic, not because of prophecy, but because people stood together, because courage replaced fear, because loyalty was stronger than tyranny." A ripple moved through the crowd. Some nodded, some wept silently, some held their children closer. Amara continued, her voice growing firmer. "A council will guide us for now, and every decision we make will be open, honest, and shared with the people. This kingdom belongs to all of us, not just the powerful, not just the loud, but every hand that works and every heart that hopes." She paused, letting the words settle, then lifted her chin slightly. "And the lions who fought beside us will be protected. They are guardians of this kingdom now, symbols of courage when courage seemed impossible." From afar in the courtyard, a deep rumbling roar echoed, Chemo's roar steady and strong. The crowd gasped as he emerged from the doorway, bandaged but standing tall. The sight of him, alive and resolute, sent a wave of awe through the people. Children clapped. Elders bowed their heads. Even the guards straightened with pride. Chemo walked slowly to Amara's side and rested his massive head against her arm. She curled her hand into his mane, feeling the warmth of his loyalty wash through her. In that moment, the kingdom felt whole, not perfect, not healed, but alive. "We will rebuild," Amara said softly, her voice carrying through the courtyard. Together, the crowd erupted, not in screams or fearful shouts, but in applause and cheers, in a chorus of voices rising to claim a future finally within reach. Sunlight poured over them all, flooding the palace with brightness so fierce it felt like a promise. And as Amara and Chemo stood side by side, guiding the first breath of a new era, the kingdom stepped forward, out of darkness, out of fear, and into a dawn they had earned with courage, loyalty, and the unbreakable power of unity.